In this video, we are going to talk about Jasmy, some of its recent price action, the important support and resistance areas, and where we can expect the price of Jasmy to go in the coming days and weeks. So we'll start by looking at the weekly chart. And what we can see here is that Jasmy has been in a very clear downtrend, basically only dumping since late 2024, back when we had the mini alt season, and we saw most of the crypto market getting a very significant rally. And more recently, since about February of this year, we've seen the dump by Jasmy starting to slow down. This is since we've seen Bitcoin get a significant relief rally, going from about 60k to over 80k. We've seen Jasmy start to consolidate and even get a slight rally, but then in the last few weeks, since we've seen Bitcoin continue to dump, we have also seen Jasmy get a very aggressive dump. It went all the way back down to where it was at the low in February. It is currently trying to hold on to this crucial support area that we've seen it get support from back in February 26, as well as from a bit below back in the October liquidation event, and also multiple times in the past in 2024 as well as 2023. So this area is very important for Jasmy, and it is right at the bottom of it currently. If it goes down just a tiny bit more and closes a weekly candle below it, this would likely lead to Jasmy continuing to drop much further, probably all the way down to its next support area, which is this one at around 0.003. So this is a very crucial decision point for Jasmy, whether it can get support from here, which will likely lead to a pretty significant rally, or if it will just continue dumping further and all the way back down to the next support area, which is basically the all-time low for Jasmy. Even if Jasmy does get support from here and a relief rally, it will likely just create a lower high. Jasmy is still very clearly in a downtrend. If we draw a trend line between these two recent highs for Jasmy, we can see that the next target for a rally for Jasmy would be about 50%, about 40 to 50%, which is quite significant actually. But for a coin with such a small market cap like Jasmy, a move of 50% isn't really anything insane. It is quite typical, and it could happen in just a few days. We've seen it happen before, and also vice versa. If Jasmy continues to dump, we could see it going all the way back down to its all-time low in just a couple of weeks. It would not be unusual for such a small market cap altcoin. Currently, I do think that a bit of a relief rally for Jasmy is possible, since I am expecting Bitcoin to get a significant relief rally sometime pretty soon. Bitcoin is currently very oversold in terms of its RSI levels, and it is also at a very important support area. The dump by Bitcoin was very fast, all the way from 82k down to 60k, but then once it hit 60k, it started getting a bit of support, like we've seen it get back in February. So I would expect Bitcoin to get a bit of a relief rally sometime in the next couple of weeks, probably to over 70k. And if that does happen, it does very much increase the chances of Jasmy following it and getting a relief rally as well. This is actually very similar in terms of structure, at least in the short term, at least in the last couple of months. The structure of Jasmy is quite similar to that of Bitcoin, and it is also following a downtrending trend line like this. So it could get a relief rally up to the trend line, which is very similar to Bitcoin, as I said, and I will show you how it is similar later in the video. So in the short term, it is very important for Jasmy to not continue dumping further. A relief rally is possible, but it's certainly not guaranteed. And if it dumps just a tiny bit more and closes a weekly candle below this support area of around 0.044, then it will likely lead to Jasmy continue to dump a lot further. So now let's go ahead and look at the 4-hour chart. But just before I do that, guys, if you're enjoying these videos and you want more updates about Jasmy as well as other altcoins and the entire crypto market in general, make sure to subscribe. It helps the channel very much, and it allows me to continue to create these updates. So make sure to hit that subscribe button. And now let's go ahead and look at the 4-hour chart. So on the 4-hour chart, again, we see what I just described here. We can see that this trend line actually goes even further back. So this trend line is actually quite strong. This would be very significant resistance if Jasmy does manage to rally up there. And as I said before, Jasmy is currently right at the bottom of this support area. It actually already started getting a bit of support, and in the next couple of days, this is a very crucial time for Jasmy to get a decision whether it can actually get a trend reversal right here off of the support area and start rallying back up to this trend line, or if it just continues dumping from here. The downtrend by Jasmy is not broken. What could potentially break it is if it breaks above this area of 0.0049. If it manages to rally above that, that would likely mean that Jasmy is getting a bit of a trend reversal and it's starting to rally back up to the trend line. But if it breaks down below this area of 0.0043, then that would likely mean that Jasmy is just going to continue to dump and get much lower, probably all the way back down to the all-time low, like I showed you on the weekly chart. So these next couple of days are actually very crucial for Jasmy, and I will definitely continue to be on the lookout. In general, at least in the long term, I have to say that I'm not optimistic about altcoins as a whole, and I would be very cautious with them since we are still in a bear market, most likely in my opinion. And historically, what leads to an altcoin season is that Bitcoin gets to new all-time highs, followed by Ethereum getting new all-time highs, which is not the scenario in the market at the moment whatsoever. Bitcoin is 50% down from its all-time high, Ethereum even more than that. So in my opinion, the chances of an altcoin season are very, very slim at the moment, and it will likely not happen anytime soon, probably not in 2026 at all, could possibly even take more than a year. Really trying to guess when it is going to happen at the moment is very speculative, and it could take a very long time. I just don't think that it is plausible for it to happen anytime soon, at least not a major altcoin season that will last for a few months. So I would be very cautious with altcoins. Of course, this isn't financial advice whatsoever, but I would personally avoid being heavy into altcoins and only consider being into some very selectively for a very short time frame and have very clear exit points, because I don't think that any altcoins are really long-term holds, and I would mostly stick to Bitcoin and Ethereum at the moment. But again, with Jasmy in the short term, there is some potential for it to get this rally up here to the trend line, but just remember that the trend is generally still a downtrend and that the chances of an altcoin season are very slim at the moment. And now looking at the chart of Jasmy against Bitcoin, we can very clearly see that it is in an absolutely horrible downtrend. It is actually at all-time lows basically. On the chart of Jasmy against the dollar, we've seen that Jasmy is still quite significantly above its all-time low, but compared to Bitcoin, it is doing absolutely horribly at levels that we haven't seen ever basically. It has gotten a bit of a recovery in the last few months, but still the trend is generally absolutely horrible, and there is no confirmation of any trend reversal despite the recent consolidation. It is still a downtrend. We could say that we have higher lows right here, but the highs are still continuing to be lower, so there is a bit of a wedge right here, and we will need to reach a decision point for Jasmy against Bitcoin sometime in the next few months of whether it can actually get a trend reversal and start rallying, or if it will just continue on dumping. And if it does break out of this wedge, then wherever it goes, the move will be quite significant, as it typically is with wedges. We can do this trend line from the highs as well as this trend line from the lows. So once Jasmy breaks out to either direction, it will lead to a pretty significant move probably. In my opinion, it is more likely for it to break down since it is still in a downtrend. It is closer to the lower part of this wedge at the moment, and also, as I said before, I'm just generally quite pessimistic about altcoins, and I think that most altcoins will significantly underperform Bitcoin as we continue into this bear market later into 2026. So I can't say anything for sure, but I think that it is more likely that it will eventually break down below this wedge and continue dumping further and underperform Bitcoin. But again, this is just in the long term, and in the short term, it is possible for it to actually get some support off of this support area, off of this trend line, and get a bit of a rally back up to this trend line. So it could actually outperform Bitcoin in the short term, as both Bitcoin and Jasmy get a relief rally in the coming weeks. That is definitely a possibility, but again, in the long term, I'm not optimistic. And now let's go ahead and look at Bitcoin. As I said, in recent weeks, Bitcoin has gotten an absolutely horrible dump all the way from 82k down back to 60k, which is where Bitcoin got the support from back in the February low. This is an area where we've seen Bitcoin have significant support and resistance back in 2024 as well as in previous cycles. This is basically the area of where Bitcoin topped back in 2021. So this is a pretty crucial decision point for Bitcoin as well. In my opinion, the most likely scenario is that Bitcoin gets a bit of a relief rally back up to the trend line, which would be at around 70 to 75k. Of course, this isn't guaranteed whatsoever, but it does seem pretty likely to me that Bitcoin will get a relief rally pretty soon, since it is incredibly oversold. Its RSI went all the way down to about 15, which is basically the same exact number of where Bitcoin got the relief rally from back in February. Also, it's the same price point as well. So it is a very similar scenario to what we've seen back in February. This time I think that the rally for Bitcoin will be smaller since it is still in a downtrend. So I think that going all the way back up to the trend line is a pretty reasonable target for Bitcoin. So I would probably expect a rally of about 20% or so for Bitcoin. And as I said before, if that does happen, that significantly increases the chances of Jasmy getting a rally as well. And if Jasmy follows Bitcoin and gets the relief rally back up to the trend line on the Jasmy chart, then that could actually lead to Jasmy outperforming Bitcoin in the short term. As I showed you before, it is possible for Jasmy to outperform Bitcoin. But again, this is just in the short term, and in my opinion, in the long term, in the coming months, and years probably, I would expect Jasmy to probably underperform Bitcoin, together with most altcoins really. Of course, there can be some exceptions, and Jasmy could be one of them, but it doesn't seem too likely in my opinion, and with most altcoins, they are just not going to be those exceptions. And with Bitcoin, after the relief rally, assuming we do get it, and it goes all the way back up to around 70 to 75k, I would expect it to get rejected off of this area and then continue dumping further, and eventually probably breaking below 60k, probably heading to significant new lows for this bear market before we eventually get another bull market. But that could take a very long time, and I would expect most of 2026 at least to continue to be a bear market year. And as I said before, I'm quite skeptical about the chances of an altcoin season anytime soon really. And one of the reasons was that historically we need to see Bitcoin and Ethereum getting into new all-time highs. And another reason is on this chart, total 3 minus USDT against Bitcoin, which basically shows the ratio of the entire altcoin market compared to Bitcoin and how altcoins are performing against Bitcoin. And historically, back in 2021 as well as in 2017, what eventually led to an altcoin season were two conditions being met. The first one is the one that I described already, of Bitcoin and Ethereum getting to new all-time highs. And the second one is this chart getting all the way down to the support area at around 0.25 of this ratio. We've seen it happen twice. Historically, only once this happens can altcoins significantly outperform Bitcoin as a whole. I'm not just talking about some specific altcoins, but I'm talking about the entire altcoin market in general. So back when this happened, in 2021 and 2017, we've seen major altcoin seasons, as you can see right here, these major rallies, and currently this chart is at 0.39, which is still very much above the support area. So this combined with Bitcoin being much lower than its all-time high makes the chances of an altcoin season anytime soon very, very slim in my opinion. Again, we can see short periods of altcoins outperforming Bitcoin, and we've actually seen it happen in the last few weeks. Since the start of May, we've actually seen altcoins outperforming Bitcoin a bit, but again, in my opinion, this will not be sustained, and this rally is still relatively small looking at the weekly chart right here. And in my opinion, it will just continue to slowly but surely go down in the coming months and probably a few years even. This chart is still pretty clearly in a downtrend for a few years now, and it could be a very long time before we see any significant altcoin season. So again, as I said before, I would personally avoid being heavy into altcoins at the moment. Again, not financial advice, but in my opinion, altcoins are only possibly a short-term hold. If a coin has a very good structure, then I could possibly get into it in the short term. But as a long-term hold, I would mostly stick to Bitcoin, maybe a bit of Ethereum, but that's really it. And it is no different with Jasmy either. Again, as I showed you before on the 4-hour chart, there is some potential for Jasmy in the short term, but in the long term, I'm not too optimistic. And now we're going to look at the page of Jasmy on CoinMarketCap. We can see right here that all time Jasmy is down 99.63%. This is an absolutely insane figure, and it just goes to show how dangerous the altcoin market can be, and why, in my opinion, holding altcoins is not a long-term move really. With altcoins, in my opinion, what you need to do is to have very clear exit points, whether you're taking profit or exiting for a loss. And really the only very long-term move for many years in the crypto market is just Bitcoin. So again, you can get into some altcoins here and there, but this is still something that is very important to remember. And now let's look at the community sentiment. We can see that it is 86% bullish. This is a bit higher than with some other altcoins, but not anything insane. We've seen most altcoins have about 75 to 90% of voters being bullish. Jasmy actually has a lot of votes. 300,000 is quite surprising for such a small market cap altcoin. This shows that it actually has a pretty significant community behind it. So 86% of the voters are bullish. In my opinion, again, in the short term, it could make some sense, but in the long term, I would have to disagree. Not anything too special right here. And looking at the crypto fear and greed index, it is currently at 14, which is extreme fear. It is just continuing to go lower and lower, despite Bitcoin actually starting to consolidate recently. In the last few days, it has gotten a bit of support, but still the fear is continuing to drop a bit lower. It was at 15 and 16 the last couple of days, but it just continues to go down. This is, of course, since we've seen Bitcoin get a very harsh dump from 82k all the way down to 60k, and the recovery is just not coming, not yet at least, despite the RSI being incredibly oversold, despite Bitcoin hitting the crucial support area of 60k, which is both a structural support area, as I showed you before on the chart, as well as a psychological support area, since it is a round number. In my opinion, it may be a matter of a few more days or weeks, but we will probably get a relief rally sometime pretty soon. As I showed you before, to the trend line, probably to a bit over 70k, and once that happens, we can probably expect the fear and greed index to go a bit more towards the neutral area. But in the long term, again, I'm still expecting Bitcoin to continue dumping further, probably head below 60k in the coming months. And once that happens and we continue the bear market, we will probably see the fear and greed index going into extreme fear again and probably staying there for a pretty long period of time. So if that does happen, which in my opinion is quite likely, just remember that this is just very typical for bear markets. After bear markets, we always get a bull market. At least that's what historically happened. So don't panic too much. And remember that this is just a natural part of the crypto cycle. And now looking at the altcoin season index, it is currently at 47, which means Bitcoin has been performing more or less right in the middle of the top 100 altcoins for the last 90 days. In the last few weeks, as I showed you before on the total free minus USDT against Bitcoin chart, altcoins have actually been outperforming Bitcoin a bit, but in my opinion, in the long term, altcoins will underperform Bitcoin, and we will see this altcoin season index going a bit further into Bitcoin season, and we could potentially stay there for a very long time, in my opinion, since in the bear market and also in the beginning of the bull market, I am expecting Bitcoin to significantly outperform most altcoins. So again, as I said before, I would mostly stick to Bitcoin and only get into some altcoins maybe with very clear exit points and only as short-term holds. So hey guys, that's going to be it for this video. If you enjoyed it and you want more updates about Jasmy as well as other altcoins and the entire crypto market in general, make sure to subscribe. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.